Welcome to the Healthcare Quality Podcast, sharing tools, tips, and techniques for healthcare quality improvement with a special focus on managing data. Here's the latest update.
Hello and welcome to the Healthcare Quality Podcast. My name is David Kashmir, and on today's episode, we're going to discuss good systems and bad systems, specifically highly reliable systems, and how to make sure that your system produces the same results every time. In particular, in this episode, we're going to discuss a rigorous way to represent patient risk with your data. So today's episode is all about how to demonstrate and ultimately decrease patient risk in your healthcare system. You can find more information about this and other healthcare quality topics in the Healthcare Quality Podcast, where we discuss at thehealthcarequalitypodcast.com on iTunes and SoundCloud several of the important quality improvement techniques that we'll be showing you today. First, let's talk about how a good system looks. And here, in particular, we focused on the time from arrival of a patient in the emergency department until they're seen by a provider. And what we've done here on the left is we've made a histogram. Each of these bars is the amount of time, or the number of patients. So let's say here we have 5 patients down here, this little bar, and then 10 patients, and then 30, and then 100. This is 100 patients who had this amount of time, some amount of time, before elapse from when they came to the emergency department until they ended up at their ultimate destination, physically left the ED and got where they're going. That is the operational definition in this case of, we'll call it MD arrival. Okay? It can be anything, but that's just what our example is here for this continuous data endpoint called time. Remember, a continuous data endpoint is an endpoint that can be infinitely divided, so hours into minutes, minutes into seconds, etc. And for continuous data, you often need a much smaller sample in order to show meaningful, significant improvement. And we invite you to review our podcast about discrete versus continuous data, and also at the blog, thehealthcarequalityblog.com, we review particulars about continuous versus discrete data. So for this continuous data endpoint, we've made this histogram. Again, our operational definition here is the elapsed time from when a patient enters the emergency department until they end up at their final destination. We called it MD arrival. We could have called it anything, but that's just what we called it here. So here's our histogram. Now, typically in healthcare systems, you'll see them focus on average time, the average amount of time that is elapsed. For these data, here is that average. Now, I'll share with you these data are normally distributed. And we know that because we ran a test regarding normality to see if these data are normally distributed. And that's called the Anderson-Darling test. We don't need to review that here, but I just share it with you to kind of put it out there that the mean, median, and mode of these data are all the same, and they're right here. Okay? So again, we typically focus in healthcare on changing our average of the process. Well, what's the average time from patient arrival until they get to where they're going? Or what's the average door to dock time? Or what's the average? I invite you today to realize that that does not adequately indicate the risk to a patient in our system. And in fact, that focus on the average, or even the median, if we're a little more sophisticated sometimes, really doesn't embody the performance of our system. But here's a way that we can. The width, or the dispersion, the range of values is a much better measure of risk to a given patient. And what I mean by that is if you had to sum this entire podcast up into one word, that word would be width. The width of the distribution of times here, the width of the distribution of times, compared to the maximum amount of time you or the patient is willing to accept. Okay? That width is a much better measure of patient risk than average time. Here we have the upper specification limit, and this can come from the voice of the customer, the patient, or if there's an internal customer like a floor nurse on the floor of your hospital, or someone whose voice matters in what we consider quality. That can be used to establish the upper specification limit. That amount of time, that maximum amount of time, above which, if a patient takes longer than that, you can say, well, that took too long, and that's a defect. So here you can see that the width of this curve is about this much, and compared to this upper spec limit and lower, least amount of time it could ever take, which is often 0 when it comes to time, you can fit many of these distributions, many of these between the upper and lower spec limit. The width of the distribution is small compared to the lower and upper spec limit. Now Minitab Minitab 19 in particular is the program we use to do this, what's called capability analysis. And this summarizes nicely, and there are a lot of nice features to this program. There are several programs that can do it, but this one is very nice for this. This will tell you how capable your particular healthcare process is. Because in healthcare, when we focus on the average so much, what we may be ignoring is that even if we shift the average of a process way down, we are not going to be anywhere near having a process that is even capable of performing to the specifications required. And we'll show you an example of that in a second. Here, let's focus on this as a good process. It's good because the dispersion, the width, the range of values is very narrow compared to the amount of space between the lower and upper spec limit. This is a very capable process of producing the results you want. Again, there's little width and plenty of space. And it's very low risk for a patient to have more than 240 minutes, the upper spec limit in this case, elapse before they get where they're going. And again, Minitab does a nice job of showing you this process is very capable. In short, the defects per 1 million opportunities for 1 million hypothetical patients entering the system, you'd only have 17 that actually fall above this upper spec limit. That's a good process. Now sometimes this score gets called a sigma level. Sigma because sigma comes from standard deviation. And in fact, if you can fit 6 standard deviations worth of data between the upper and lower spec limit, it's a very capable process. And it will produce only approximately 3.4 defects per every 1 million opportunities. That's where the term 6 sigma comes from. Now for those of us in healthcare, we're often slow to adapt these methodologies. We're slow to adapt them, and we're slow to adopt them despite the fact that the tools don't have any idea what the particular system being studied is. They may have come from manufacturing or at least become popularized there, but in fact these work very well for service industries as well. So again, here we have a good process. It's very capable of producing what we want, and there's only a little bit of width and plenty of space between the lower and upper specification limit, and the sigma level, or z-score in this case, is 4.15. That's a very strong process, very capable. Now let's look at a situation where patients are at higher risk for having a bad outcome or an unacceptable amount of time before they get where they're going. Again, the upper spec limit is 240 minutes from wherever we got that from, the voice of the patient, a physician in the ED who says it's too long, whatever we adopt as our upper spec limit. And here we have a process that is not very capable of producing the results we want. Even if we shift the mean median mode, even if we shift the central tendency of the data downward, we still have barely enough space between the lower and upper spec limit. The fact that we have very little space between the lower and upper spec limit indicates a process that is not very capable. Sometimes we have processes that are so not capable of producing a great outcome that we can't even fit one standard deviation of data between the lower and upper spec limit. In fact, here we can only fit approximately 1.2. Now this was chosen for a reason, and that's because it turns out that in most service industries, this level of performance Okay, this width compared to this space is approximately 1 to 1.5 sigma. That's the routine level of performance for most service industries before we kind of look in on it and do anything about it. It's one defect in every 1,000 opportunities approximately, and the defect per million opportunities in this example, and again, that's just a kind of a customary way to describe with a common denominator, with a typical denominator, what our level of defect production is. So it's called DPMO, and per million opportunities, we would make 114,951 defects. That corresponds to a z-score of about 1.2. Again, the typical performance for a service industry is a z-score of about 1 to 1.5, sigma level 1 to 1.5. And here, this shows one of the issues we typically have in healthcare. Even if we focused on moving the average, we said, boy, we are going to fight to get our average time for patients when they come to the emergency department down. We're going to shift this whole curve down. Well, guess what? The process is still not very capable of routinely and robustly giving the outcomes we want for an individual patient. In other words, there's lots of width and relatively little space between the lower and upper spec limit. It's high risk for a patient. For any particular patient entering this system, there's a substantial risk that they're going to have more than a 240-minute wait, or a wait greater than the upper spec limit, or a defect. And again, this is a very typical defect rate per service industries, and particularly for healthcare processes when we first look at them. So when we talk about how to demonstrate patient risk in our healthcare system, this sort of process, whether it be with Minitab or another program, very nicely highlights the capability of the process. And again, patient risk is directly related to the width of this type of curve, this type of histogram, versus the upper and the lower spec limit. Truly great systems are designed such that there is a smaller amount of variation between different values, different parts of the histogram. So the histogram is more narrow, like our good example. It's more narrow. And when you design a system that way, what you see is that you much more routinely get excellent outcomes. It's much lower risk for the patient. And again, this is a nice way to characterize risk for an individual patient. And now that you've seen that, we invite you to come talk about it. You can write us on the podcast homepage, which is thehealthcarequalitypodcast.com. You can come visit us on the healthcarequalityblog.com, which reviews many of these different issues and talks about how we apply these tools to healthcare and how we see our data and how we talk about patient risk. So we invite you to do all that. I hope you have a great day and that you found this tool to be useful for you and your practice.
Did you know the HQP is on SoundCloud and iTunes? Visit us there and at the podcast's home, surgicalbusinessmodelinnovation.com.